Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Part 1, The House That Felt Heavy. My name is Claire Morrison. My husband's name is David. We have been married for 11 years. We live in a 3-bedroom house in Columbus, Ohio, with our 2 children, Emma, who is 9, and Tyler, who is 6. From the outside, our life looks ordinary, and it is ordinary in most of the ways that matter. We are not rich and not poor. We are not famous and not invisible. We have jobs, bills, a minivan that needs new tires, a backyard with a swing set that creaks in the wind. We have good days and bad days, and the kind of familiar, textured life that most people in their 30s have. But 2 years ago, our ordinary life had a problem that was not visible from the outside. A problem that lived inside our house, inside our minds, inside our conversations, inside the way we woke up in the morning and went to sleep at night. Our house felt heavy. Not literally. It was a perfectly normal house with normal rooms and normal light coming through the windows. But the atmosphere inside it was heavy. Every conversation seemed to carry an invisible weight. Every problem felt larger than it was. Every disappointment, and life is full of small disappointments, felt like evidence of something larger and darker, evidence that things were not going to get better, that this was simply how life was, that hoping for more was naive. David and I had become, without fully realizing it, 2 of the most negative people we knew. Not dramatically negative, not angry or cruel or hopeless, just persistently, quietly, habitually negative. We complained more than we expressed gratitude. We noticed problems more than possibilities. We expected the worst more often than the best. We talked about what was wrong with our jobs, our finances, our bodies, our neighborhood, our country, and rarely about what was right. This is the story of how we figured that out and what happened when we decided to change it. Part 2, David's story. To understand why our house felt heavy, you need to understand where we each came from, because negative thinking is rarely a choice anyone makes deliberately. It is almost always a habit, formed in childhood, reinforced by experience, and carried into adulthood so naturally that it stops feeling like a habit and starts feeling like reality. David grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was the middle child of 3, an older sister who was high-achieving and a younger brother who was the family charmer. David was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who did not cause problems and therefore did not get much attention. His father was a good man who had a difficult life. He had worked at a steel plant that closed when David was 12, and the years that followed, the job surge, the financial stress, the visible worry that lived in his father's face, taught David a specific lesson about the world. The lesson was, things do not usually work out. You prepare for the worst because the worst tends to come. You do not get your hopes up because hope makes the fall harder. These were not lessons his father taught in words. They were lessons David absorbed from watching, from his father's sighs at the dinner table, from the way bad news was always expected and good news was always met with suspicion. It's too good to be true. Don't count your chickens. Something will go wrong. By the time David was an adult, this way of thinking was so deeply embedded that he did not recognize it as a perspective. He recognized it as accuracy. He was not a pessimist, he would have told you. He was a realist. This is the first and most important thing to understand about negative thinking. The people who are most deeply in it are usually the last to see it as negative. It feels from the inside like clear-eyed honesty. Lesson. Negative thinking does not feel negative from the inside. It feels like being honest about how the world really works. That is why it is so hard to see and so important to examine. Part 3, Claire's story. My story is different from David's, but arrives at the same place. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. My parents were warm, loving people who were also, in the specific way of their generation and their faith, very focused on what could go wrong. Not out of cruelty, out of love. Worrying about your children in the family I grew up in was a form of caring. The more you loved someone, the more you worried about them. Optimism was almost associated with carelessness. If you were not worried, you were not paying attention. I was an anxious child who became an anxious adult. Not clinically anxious. I never needed medication or therapy for it. But I was a person who, in any given situation, automatically scanned for what could go wrong before she noticed what was going right. Planning a vacation, my first thought was all the things that could go wrong. Starting a new job, my first thought was all the ways I might fail. Good news, my first instinct was to search for the catch. I was also, like David, not a dramatic negative person. I functioned fine. I was capable and productive and reasonably cheerful in public. But in the private interior of my mind and in the private interior of our house, the default setting was worry, preparation for disappointment, and a general low-grade suspicion that things were fragile than they appeared. When David and I met and fell in love at 26, we recognized something in each other. Not our negativity, we were both too much inside it to see it clearly, but a certain familiar seriousness, a shared sense that life was complicated and that careful people didn't expect too much from it. We built a life on that shared foundation, and for a long time it was enough. And then it wasn't. Lesson. Negative thinking is often passed down through love. Parents who worried were caring, but worry is not love, and a child who learns to worry learns to live in the future instead of the present. Part 4. Two negative minds in one house. Here is something important about negative thinking that most people do not fully appreciate. It compounds when two people share a space. One negative mind produces a certain amount of difficulty. Two negative minds living together, feeding each other's perspectives, reinforcing each other's worst interpretations of events, produce something significantly worse than either would produce alone. David and I did not argue constantly. We were not a couple in visible crisis, but our daily conversations had a particular tone that, looking back, I can identify clearly. When one of us complained, the other agreed and added their own complaint. When one of us worried about something, the other supplied additional reasons to worry. When something good happened, we both immediately looked for the shadow behind it. We had developed what I now call a negativity echo chamber, a shared mental space in which negative interpretations were always validated and positive ones were always softened or questioned. It felt like honest communication. It was actually a closed loop that made both of us more negative over time, not less. Our children noticed before we did. Emma, at 8 years old, once said at dinner, "How come you and Dad always talk about bad stuff?" David and I looked at each other. Then we looked at our plates. Then we changed the subject. But Emma's question stayed with me, not because it stung, because it was accurate. And children's accurate observations have a particular power to cut through the comfortable stories adults tell themselves about who they are. We did always talk about bad stuff. Not only bad stuff, but consistently, reliably, as a default, bad stuff. Lesson. Two negative minds in one house do not cancel each other out. They multiply. Pay attention to the tone of your shared conversations. Children notice before adults do. Part 5. The night everything broke. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in October. David had had a hard week at work. He was a project manager at a construction company, and a large project had fallen behind schedule, not because of anything he had done wrong, but because of factors outside his control. His manager had been critical, his team had been difficult. He came home tired and frustrated. I had had my own hard week. I worked part-time as a dental hygienist and part-time managing the house, the children, the schedules, the endless small logistics of family life. I had been doing too much and feeling unseen. A conversation with my sister that week had left me feeling worse about myself than better. We sat at the dinner table, the four of us, and the meal was quiet in the wrong way. After the children went to bed, David and I sat in the living room and did what we had been doing for years. We talked about everything that was wrong. His job, my exhaustion, the money we didn't have enough of, the house that needed repairs we couldn't afford, the neighborhood that had changed, the country that was going in the wrong direction, the future that looked harder, not easier. We talked for 45 minutes, and then I stopped. I stopped and I looked at David, at his face, which was tight with stress, at the lines around his eyes that had deepened in the last few years, and I thought, we are doing this to ourselves, both of us, together, every single night. David, I said, do you realize we have been talking for 45 minutes and we have not said one single positive thing? He looked at me, then he looked at the wall, then he said, quietly, is there anything positive to say? And that answer, that honest, tired answer, was the moment I understood how serious things had become. Part 6. The Book on the Nightstand. The next morning, I went to the library. Not because I had a plan, because I needed to do something, and the library was where I went when I needed to think. I walked through the self-help section, slowly, not sure what I was looking for. Most of the books felt too loud, too promising, too full of exclamation points and miracle claims. I was skeptical by nature, and I did not want to be sold something. I wanted to understand something. I picked up a book about the neuroscience of positive thinking, not a motivational book, a scientific one, written by a researcher who studied how thought patterns affect brain chemistry and behavior. I read the first 3 pages standing in the aisle. I checked it out and took it home. I read it over 3 evenings. I left it on David's nightstand on the 4th day with a note. I'm not asking you to agree with everything, just read the first 2 chapters. David picked it up the following Sunday morning. He read the first 2 chapters, then the 3rd. Then he came downstairs with the book in his hand and said, some of this is interesting. Not all of it, but some of it. Coming from David, who approached most new ideas with the caution of someone who expected to be disappointed by them, this was significant. Which parts, I asked. The part about how the brain forms habits of thinking the same way it forms habits of anything else, that negative thinking is literally a neural pathway, a groove in the brain that gets deeper every time you use it, that the way to change it is to build new pathways through new habits, not through willpower, through practice. I looked at him. That's the part I wanted you to read, I said. Part 7. What positive thinking is not. Before we went any further, before we tried anything, David and I had to agree on what we were not talking about, because we had both independently strong objections to what we thought positive thinking meant. And those objections were reasonable. They were just aimed at the wrong target. Positive thinking is not pretending that problems do not exist. This was David's primary objection. He was afraid that positive thinking meant closing your eyes to reality, that it was the philosophy of people who ignored real problems and then were blindsided by them. He had spent his life preparing for problems. He did not want to stop preparing. But that is not what positive thinking is. A positive thinker still sees the problem. They simply do not dwell in it unnecessarily. They assess it clearly, decide what can be done, do it, and move forward, rather than rehearsing the problem endlessly in their minds, finding additional angles of worry, and allowing the anxiety to spread into parts of life the problem does not actually affect. Positive thinking is not toxic positivity. This was my objection. I had encountered people who responded to every difficulty with relentless cheerfulness. Everything happens for a reason. Just be grateful. Focus on the good. And I found it both dishonest and slightly insulting. Life is genuinely hard sometimes. Pretending otherwise is not strength. It is avoidance. But that is also not what positive thinking is. Real positive thinking does not deny difficulty. It chooses, in the face of difficulty, to focus on what can be done rather than what cannot, on what is working rather than only on what is broken, on the presence of good things alongside the bad things, not instead of them. Positive thinking, properly understood, is not a feeling, it is a practice, a disciplined way of directing attention toward what is real and possible and good without pretending that what is difficult and painful and challenging is not also real. Lesson. Positive thinking is not pretending the storm does not exist. It is choosing to look for the door instead of staring at the rain. The storm is real. The door is also real. Part 8. The Science of the Mind. The book I had found and the research it summarized gave us something that neither of us had expected to find, a scientific framework for understanding why changing your thinking is both possible and necessary. The brain, the research explains, is not fixed. For most of human history, scientists believed that the adult brain was essentially unchangeable, that the neural structure you developed in childhood and adolescence was what you were stuck with for life. This view has been thoroughly overturned by decades of neuroscience research. The brain remains plastic, changeable, adaptable to new patterns of thought and behavior throughout a person's entire life. This property is called neuroplasticity, and its implications for thinking habits are profound. Every thought you think activates a neural pathway. Thoughts you think repeatedly strengthen those pathways, making them faster, deeper, more automatic. Negative thoughts thought repeatedly become the brain's default mode, a path of least resistance, the automatic response to any stimulus. This is why negative thinkers find it so hard to stop being negative. They have literally built a super highway of negativity in their brains, and the positive alternative is a barely used dirt road. But here's the good news, and this was the part that changed David's mind more than anything else. The brain can be rewired, not easily or quickly, but genuinely. New pathways can be built through new patterns of thought and attention. The negativity superhighway doesn't disappear, but it can stop being the default route. With practice, the positive pathway can become wide enough and fast enough to compete. The practice required is not complex. It is simply consistent. New thoughts, chosen deliberately, practiced regularly over time. Lesson: your brain is not a fixed machine. It is a living system that changes based on what you practice. Practice negativity, and it becomes automatic. Practice positivity, and that becomes automatic too. You choose what to practice. Part 9. Claire's first step. I started before David, not because I was more willing. I simply had less resistance to the idea. I had already been thinking about it longer. My first practice was simple. Every morning before I got out of bed, I would think of 3 things I was grateful for. Not big things, small things were fine. The warmth of the blanket, the sound of Tyler's feet padding down the hallway, coffee, the fact that Emma had slept well after a week of bad dreams. Specific, real, small things. It felt artificial at first, forced, like putting on a happy face when I didn't feel happy. I almost stopped after 3 days, but I kept going, and something happened around day 10 that I didn't expect. I noticed that I was starting to look for the 3 things during the day, not just in the morning, that some part of my mind had begun scanning the day for things worth noting, not replacing the worry, not erasing the difficulty, just adding something to the picture that hadn't been there before. By week 3, my mornings felt different. Not dramatically. I wasn't waking up in a state of joy, but the heaviness was slightly lighter. The first thought of the day was no longer automatically about what I had to do or what I was worried about. It was, for a few quiet minutes, about something that was actually good. I didn't tell David what I was doing at first. I didn't want to pressure him, but one morning he came downstairs and found me sitting at the kitchen table with a small notebook, the one I had started using to write my 3 things, and he asked, "What are you writing?" "3 things I'm grateful for," I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then he poured his coffee and sat down across from me, and he didn't say anything dismissive. He just sat. Part 10. David resists. David did not start with me. He needed more time and more proof. This was consistent with who David was. He did not adopt new ideas quickly. He examined them, questioned them, looked for the flaws, waited to see if the evidence held up. This was not obstinacy. It was integrity. He did not want to believe something just because it was comforting. He wanted to believe something because it was true. His first objection to the gratitude practice was practical.
I understand the science, he said one evening. I'm not disputing that the brain changes through practice, but isn't writing down 3 things you're grateful for just training yourself to ignore problems? If something is wrong, it's wrong. Writing that you're grateful for your coffee doesn't fix what's wrong. I had thought about this. I had an answer ready. No, I said, it doesn't fix what's wrong, but it reminds you that what's wrong is not all there is. You still know the problem exists. You still work on it, but your brain is also holding the good things, not just the bad ones, and that changes how you feel while you work on the problem, which changes how effectively you work on it. He thought about this for a while. The anxiety I feel about work doesn't actually make my work better, does it? Does it? I asked. A long pause. No, he said. I think it probably makes it worse. I think the stress makes me less clear-headed, less effective, not more. I said nothing. I let him sit with that, because David needed to arrive at things himself. That was the kind of man he was, and arriving at things yourself is always more powerful than being told them by someone else. Lesson. Worry does not solve problems, it rehearses them, and rehearsing a problem does not make you better at solving it. It makes you more tired and less clear.
Part 11, the gratitude experiment. 2 weeks after our conversation, David came to me with a proposal. I want to try an experiment, he said. 30 days. I'll do the 3 things every morning, but I want to track whether it actually makes a difference, not just in how I feel, but in how I perform, at work, as a parent, as a husband. I smiled. This was so perfectly David, turning a practice into a data collection exercise, bringing his engineering mind to an emotional problem. But I was not going to argue with the method if it meant he was going to try. Deal, I said. How will you measure it? I'll rate my day from 1 to 10 every evening, he said. Energy levels, quality of work, patience with the kids, how I feel in the evenings, before and after the 30 days. He started the next morning. He was skeptical and methodical and slightly self-conscious about the whole thing. I could see him at the kitchen table with his notebook, looking like a man who was performing an experiment on himself that he was not entirely sure he believed in. By day 12, he said nothing about the practice, but I noticed something. He was coming home from work slightly differently, not dramatically, a few minutes earlier, with a slightly looser energy. He asked the children about their days with what seemed like genuine interest rather than the tired, going through the motions quality that the evenings had sometimes had. On day 20, I asked him how the experiment was going. He looked at his notebook. He looked at me, then he said in the specific tone of a man who has been surprised by something he expected to disprove, "The average evening rating is up by 2 points. My patience with Tyler is measurably better. I don't know if it's the gratitude practice or something else, but something is different." Part 12, How Thoughts Become Reality. As David and I both continued our practices, we started talking more seriously about the mechanism, about how exactly thoughts become reality. Not in a mystical sense, neither of us believed in the law of attraction or magical thinking, but in a practical, psychological, behavioral sense. The connection is not complicated once you see it. Your thoughts shape your emotions shape your behavior shapes your results, and your results become the reality you live in. A negative thought, "This project is going to fail," creates an emotion, anxiety, discouragement. That emotion shapes behavior. David would approach the project half-heartedly, expect obstacles, communicate defensively with his team. Those behaviors produce results, a project that is harder than it needs to be, a team that is less collaborative, outcomes that confirm the original negative expectation. The negative thought has created the negative reality it was worried about. A positive thought, Not naive, not denial, but genuinely constructive. This project has challenges, and I have handled challenges before, and I can handle these, creates a different emotion, engaged confidence. That emotion shapes different behavior, focused problem solving, clear communication, energy directed at solutions. Those behaviors produce different results, and those results become a reality that is genuinely different from the one the negative thought was creating. This is not magic, it is psychology and behavioral science, observed and documented over decades of research. The thought is the beginning of the chain, and you have more control over the thought than most people exercise. David was particularly struck by this framework. He said, "I've been treating my negative thoughts as if they were observing reality, but they were actually creating it. All this time I thought I was being realistic, I was being self-fulfilling." Lesson: your thoughts are not just observing your life, they are building it. Every thought is a small decision about the kind of reality you are going to create. Part 13. David's turning point. David's real turning point came 6 weeks into his experiment, in a moment that had nothing to do with gratitude journals or brain science. It came from Tyler. Tyler was 6. He was at the age where children repeat things they hear, not maliciously, just because they are like small tape recorders that have not yet learned to edit what they play back. One Saturday afternoon, David was in the garage doing something to the car, a minor repair that was not going well. Tyler was watching from the doorway. David said something under his breath, a frustrated mutter about the car, about the cost of repairs, about nothing going right. He said it quietly, not aimed at Tyler, not meant for Tyler, just the automatic overflow of a frustrated mind. Tyler walked away. 20 minutes later, David heard him in the backyard. Tyler was trying to put together a small toy, a construction set with pieces that weren't fitting properly, and Tyler was saying in his 6-year-old voice, almost word for word what David had said in the garage. "Nothing ever goes right. This is too hard. It never works." David stood at the garage door and listened, and felt something. Not guilt, not quite, but something deeper, a recognition that landed in his chest and stayed. He went to Tyler. He sat down beside him on the grass. He helped him with the toy, and while they worked, he said, "Tyler, this is tricky, but tricky things are the best practice. Let's figure it out." Tyler looked up at him. Then he tried again. The piece fit. He grinned. David came inside and found me in the kitchen. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I've been teaching him to think without meaning to. I've been teaching him my way of thinking." Part 14. Positive thinking in marriage. Once David and I were both practicing, both actively working to redirect our thinking, something began to change between us that was separate from and perhaps more important than what was changing individually. Our conversations changed. Not all at once, gradually, in small ways, like the way seasons change. The first change I noticed was that when one of us complained, the other no longer automatically amplified the complaint. Instead, we began to ask a different question. What can be done about this? Not dismissively, not stop complaining and be positive. The complaint was heard, the difficulty was acknowledged, and then instead of adding another layer of worry, the response was practical and forward-looking. What can we actually do? What is one step we can take here? What is actually in our control here? This change sounds small. It was not small. It transformed the energy of our evenings completely. The 45-minute spirals of shared negativity became 20-minute conversations that ended with something actionable rather than something heavier. The second change was in how we spoke about each other and to each other. We began to notice more consciously the difference between criticizing what the other person was doing and appreciating what the other person was doing. Both things were true, but we had been almost exclusively focused on the former and almost never on the latter. David started saying thank you for things he had never acknowledged before. Not big things, small ones. Dinner made, homework helped, a worry he'd shared
hard that I had listened to. I started saying the same. Within a few weeks, the temperature of our house had changed in a way that neither of us could fully explain, but both of us could feel. Lesson. In marriage, what you choose to see in your partner becomes over time what you get. Look for what is good. Say it out loud. Watch what happens. Part 15. The hard days. I want to be honest because stories about positive thinking can sound, in the telling, easier than they are in the living, and I do not want to give you the impression that David and I changed our thinking patterns in a few weeks and lived happily ever after in a cloud of gratitude and optimism. That is not what happened. There were hard days, days when the practice felt impossible, days when something genuinely bad happened and all the reframing in the world felt inadequate, days when David came home from a particularly bad week at work and the old negativity filled the house like smoke and neither of us could breathe through it. Days when I was too tired and too stressed to choose my thoughts carefully, and I said the wrong thing in the wrong tone, and we were right back in the old pattern, the old echo chamber, the old closed loop. What had changed on those hard days was not that the difficulty went away, it was that we both knew now that the pattern existed, and knowing the pattern exists changes your relationship to it. You can see it from outside instead of being only inside it. You can say, "We are in the old pattern, let's stop for a moment." And sometimes that recognition alone was enough to interrupt it. Not always. Sometimes we went all the way around the spiral before we caught it, but the spirals got shorter and the recovery got faster. And the morning after a bad evening, one of us almost always started the day with something like, "Last night was hard. I'm glad we talked, even if it wasn't pretty." Small words, real words, enough words. Lesson. Positive thinking does not eliminate hard days, it changes your relationship to them. You can see the pattern, you can interrupt it, you can recover faster. That is enough.
Part 16. What changed between them? 6 months into our practice, both of us, together, consistently, I sat down one evening and tried to articulate what had actually changed, not in general terms, but specifically, because I wanted to understand it clearly enough to keep it. The most significant change was this: we had stopped being each other's evidence that the world was difficult. In the old version of our relationship, David's bad day confirmed my worry that things were not going well. My anxiety about money confirmed his fear that security was fragile. We were each giving the other constant material for the story that life was hard and getting harder. We were building a shared reality out of our shared worst interpretations. In the new version, we had become each other's counter-evidence. When David had a hard day, I was no longer adding to the pile of difficulty. I was the person asking, what was one good thing about today? Not to deny the hard day, but to ensure that the hard day was not the only thing on the table. He did the same for me. We had also become more genuinely curious about each other. This surprised me. I had not expected that changing how we thought would change how interested we were in each other, but it did. When you stop expecting the worst from a conversation, you start actually listening to it. When you stop bracing for complaint, you start hearing the person underneath the complaint, the person you fell in love with, who was always there, who had been somewhat obscured by the layer of shared negativity we had built over 11 years. Emma noticed first. She said at breakfast one morning, "You guys seem happier." David and I looked at each other. Then we smiled. Real ones, the kind that you cannot plan. Part 17. Teaching their children. The change in how David and I thought did not stay only with us. It moved, naturally and gradually, into how we parented. We became more conscious of the language we used around Emma and Tyler, not in a controlling way, not censoring every imperfect word, but in a general shift of awareness. When something went wrong, we started asking different questions out loud so the children could hear the thinking process. Instead of course this happened, nothing ever goes smoothly, we started saying, "This is frustrating, what can we do about it?" Instead of, "I'm worried about how this is going to go," we started saying, "This is new and uncertain. Let's see what happens." Small changes in language, large changes in what the children were learning about how to respond to difficulty. We started a family gratitude practice at dinner, not heavy or formal, just simple.
Each person said one good thing about their day before we talked about anything else. At first, Tyler thought it was silly and said pizza 3 nights in a row, but within a month, he was saying real things, things he had noticed, things he was proud of, the way his friends had waited for him when he was slow getting his coat on, the fact that he had read a whole page without stopping. Emma, who was 9 and more self-aware than most adults I know, asked me one evening, "Mom, why did we start doing this?" Because we realized we were focusing too much on the hard things and not enough on the good ones, and we wanted to change that. "Were you unhappy before?" she asked. I thought about how to answer honestly. Not unhappy, but heavier than we needed to be, and we didn't want to teach you to be heavy too. Part 18, 1 year later. It has been a little over a year since that Thursday evening when I asked David if there was anything positive to say, and he could not think of an answer. Our house doesn't feel heavy anymore, not because our life has become easier, it has not. David still has difficult weeks at work. I still have days when I'm overwhelmed by the demands of work and family and all the small things that need to be done. We still have disagreements. We still have hard months. Life has not become a different thing. It is still ordinary, textured, full of both good and difficult things. What has changed is the lens through which we look at it. The gratitude practice has become for both of us as natural as brushing our teeth, not something we have to remind ourselves to do, something we do because the absence of it is now noticeable. On the rare mornings when I skip it, something feels slightly off about the day, not catastrophically, just slightly, like a meal without salt. David still approaches problems carefully and systematically. He did not become a different person. His natural caution and thoroughness, which were always strength, are still there, but they are no longer accompanied by the chronic anxiety that used to shadow everything. He is still realistic. He is also, finally, hopeful. And between us, in the house, at the dinner table, in the conversations that happen after the children go to bed, there is something that wasn't there before, a lightness, a genuine interest in each other, a shared project that is not just managing a household and raising children, but building something together, a particular kind of life with a particular quality of attention that we have decided on purpose. Yellow lesson. 1 year of consistent practice does not solve every problem. It changes the lens through which you see the problems you have, and a different lens changes everything. Part 19. What we know now. David and I talk about this sometimes, about what we know now that we didn't know 2 years ago. Here's our list, not a scientific list, a lived one, from a real marriage, in a real house, with real children and real problems, and one minivan that still needs new tires. Yellow lesson. What we know, 1. Negative thinking is a habit, not a truth. It feels like accuracy, like clear-eyed realism, but it is a practiced pattern that has become automatic, and because it's a habit, it can be changed, not easily, not quickly, but genuinely with practice over time. Yellow lesson. What we know, 2. Your thoughts are contagious in a marriage. What one person thinks and says becomes the shared atmosphere of the home. You are always either adding to the heaviness or lightening it. You rarely do nothing. Be aware of which one you are doing. Yellow lesson. What we know, 3. Gratitude is not a feeling. It is a practice. You don't wait until you feel grateful to practice it. You practice it until the feeling comes, and the feeling does come, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually and genuinely. Yellow lesson. What we know, 4. Children learn how to think by watching their parents think, not from what you tell them, from what you model. Every complaint said out loud, every worry voiced at the dinner table, every nothing ever works out muttered under your breath is a lesson about how to interpret the world. Yellow lesson. What we know, 5. Positive thinking does not remove problems, it changes your energy while you solve them. A calm, focused, hopeful mind solves problems better than a stressed, scattered, defeated one. This is not theory, we have lived it. Yellow lesson. What we know, 6. The most important change is the first one, the decision, real, serious, committed, to try. Everything else comes from that, but the decision has to be real, not I'll try to be more positive. Real, I am going to build a new habit of thought, starting now, every day, without stopping. Part 20. Choose your thoughts. I want to end this story where it began, in a house in Columbus, Ohio, with two ordinary people and two children and a life that isn't perfect and never will be. But I want to end it differently than it began, not with heaviness, with what we have found on the other side of the decision to think differently. The morning I am writing this, I woke up early, earlier than I needed to. The house was quiet, David still asleep, Emma and Tyler still asleep, the particular peaceful stillness of a household that has not started its day. I made coffee, I sat at the kitchen table with my small notebook. I wrote 3 things. The quiet of this morning, David's face when he is sleeping, younger, unguarded, the face of the person I chose 13 years ago and keep choosing. The way Tyler last night at dinner said one good thing about his day without being asked, as natural as breathing, as if it had always been part of how he moved through the world. Small things, real things, mine. I'm not a perfectly positive person. I never will be. The old neural pathways are still there. I can feel them when the stress gets high and the default pulls toward worry and complaint. I probably always will. That's not the goal. The goal is to be someone who notices the thought, who sees it clearly, who asks, is this thought helping me? Is this the story I want to tell about my life? Is this what I want to teach my children about the world? And then, not always perfectly, not always immediately, chooses differently. That choice is available to you too, not someday, not when your circumstances are better or your life is easier or your problems are resolved. Right now, in whatever life you are in with whatever difficulties you are carrying, the thought comes first, the life follows. Choose well. Final lesson. Positive thinking is not a personality trait. It is a daily decision, made in the morning before you get out of bed, made at the dinner table, in the conversations you have with the person you love. It doesn't change your circumstances. It changes you. And you, changed, clearer, more hopeful, more grateful, change everything around you. Start with one thought, then another, then make it a practice. The house will change, the marriage will change, the children will learn. Everything begins with what you choose to think.